It is amazing to me that we have, this political movement predicated on not allowing criminal immigrants into our country. Yet there seems to be some serious allegations that they went out of their way to secure the free right of travel to the United States from this guy who has a mountain of allegations against him. And then he comes to the United States and then is alleged to have committed another crime while he's here. It is really astounding.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. And it's extraordinary to me also that so many of the figures on the right who have been so outspoken about sex trafficking and trafficking of children and minors seem to be so willing to totally overlook the evidence in relation to the Tate brothers, because the Tate brothers have been politically useful and are politically aligned with many of those figures. Elon Musk, who has tweeted and kind of done a lot to propagate conspiracy theories about Asian grooming gangs in the UK. It's tweeted suggesting that the case against the brothers is just a distraction from what he calls real or actual sex trafficking. And I think that there's just a question mark about whether those characters are willing to believe that people who are aligned with them politically are capable of doing any such thing, regardless of the evidence and however voluminously it stacks up.
Yeah, and the amount of hypocrisy here is too much to describe, but you describe also how anti-religious he is. If the conservative movement includes so many evangelicals, obviously so many of the crimes he's committed have, you know, like are immoral under any religion, but he also is quoted as saying, when a woman didn't want to be on webcams because of her religion, I think this is Andrew Tate was quoted as saying she never believed.
Yeah, I found that a really particularly chilling quote of his. Just the utter contempt for this woman and her belief system and the values that she clearly held. She'd said to him, "I believe in God. My body is intimate. Only my husband should be able to touch and see it." And he boasted to his supporters and associates that he'd identified all her objections and destroyed them. He described himself as a shepherd leading the sheep, and yeah, as you say, said that she never believed in anything. He has publicly styled himself now as a Muslim. He said he converted to Islam a few years ago. And so he kind of portrays himself as being very devout. When he got out of jail, he emerged holding a copy of the Quran and said he was going to go back to his compound and pray. But I think many people question the sincerity of his conversion, given what we know about his views and attitudes.
Yeah, and you know, the way he recruits people, I think, is worth like he like Jeffrey Epstein and a lot of predators seem to have this knack for finding people in vulnerable positions, and he seeks them out and exploits their vulnerabilities, and then he has a community for which he then brags and teaches them how to exploit people's vulnerabilities.
That's right. Yeah, it's really one of the things I think that was most striking for me in reporting on this and studying the messages that were exchanged between the Tate brothers and their supporters and subscribers in the War Room, this men's network, in which they were teaching these techniques of recruiting and exploiting women, was just how systematic this was and how studied it was. They had really spent so much time honing these techniques, codifying these techniques. The way in which you gradually wore down a woman's self-esteem, her beliefs, you gradually isolated her from her friends and family. You kept her constantly off balance and confused. You gradually normalized your mistreatment of her in a way that made it difficult for her to notice what was really going on. And all of these things were described explicitly. These guys were absolutely clear about what it was they were doing and teaching other men to do. And then the kind of tenor of the conversation between them and some of these associates who then are themselves recruiting women into sex work. And you can see them sharing screenshots of the women that they have working online for them, whose money they're taking. But they're really delighting in their mistreatment of these women. There's one guy who brags that he's making six figures from making his girlfriend stream online for 13 hours at a time. And he shares that he has her sleeping on a concrete floor in a garage with no AC and spiders and cockroaches. And it shares a photo of her live streaming in this really kind of grimy workspace and is celebrated. Tristan Tate says, "Awesome work." And so it's almost like that the cruelty towards these women, the utter contempt for these women is a cause for celebration, an article of pride for these guys. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that kind of the way in which they identify and then exploit vulnerability is something really striking in these messages.
Yeah, you described one of the recruits and like sort of star pupils. I think his name is Obusic or something.
That's
Who
right.
who it seems like based on your reporting, like was chronicling his own abuse, like, he had hit his girlfriend slash whatever we wanna call, his, you know, trafficked
His
individual,
workers.
whatever, I
Yeah.
don't know what it is, over the head with a keyboard? Am I
That's
remembering this
right.
correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. He's kind of asked by another member how he subdued unruly workers and talked about, he hit her on the head with a keyboard until she went into the room and worked for 7 hours without a break. And then he bragged that he'd hit every woman that he was with. He talked about how he'd bribed law enforcement to get off charges of battering people over the head with bricks. I mean, the level of kind of violence in these discussions is really shocking. And this guy, he talked freely about this, and then was really elevated by the Tates. He ends up getting his own Telegram channel within the war room where he's teaching what he calls raw, uncensored methods of pimping and handling women, alongside the Tate brothers, who also join him in that space. So yeah, there is a real celebration of pretty extreme cruelty and violence towards the women in this world.
Yeah, he was elevated. That's the
Yeah,
key part here. It's not like he was punished and
yeah,
ostracized after he was sharing all this information.
yeah.
And
That's
I
right.
think this gets at the real threat of Tate. There's the acute threat of his behavior in the proximate sense to the people he victimizes, which is obviously quite serious and extensive in its own right. But there's this larger threat, which is he's now creating all these disciples. And so now we've gotten this situation where, yes, we have to prosecute him and hold him accountable for his behavior. But now we've got a movement of people out there who are training on trafficking women, mistreating women. And look, like, even if they weren't trafficking and mistreating women, which obviously there's pretty substantial evidence that they are, their ideology is very dangerous.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I really wanted this to be a story, that was not about speech, but was about action. That was about this is what these guys have done, because they've managed to sort of reframe the case against them as being one about speech, and
Right.
portray themselves as free speech martyrs. And so I wanted to kind of like put that aside and focus on, yeah, what did you guys actually do here? What's the evidence? But it's absolutely true that when you pan out and look at the scale of their influence around the world, it's really chilling. In the UK, police here have declared a national emergency over the upsurge in violence against women that they've explicitly linked to Andrew Tate and other influencers like him. They've warned that Andrew Tate is radicalizing young men in what they call a quite terrifying manner. And there have been really alarming reports of sexual violence and even murder by people who've recently consumed Andrew Tate's content. And so that is terrifying.